Secure people react to avoidant breadcrumbing like this, and most people never see it coming because breadcrumbing rarely looks cruel in the beginning. It looks hopeful, it sounds soft, it arrives as a late-night message right when you were finally trying to move on. It appears as a sudden burst of attention after days of silence, a random compliment, a deep conversation at the perfect moment, just enough emotional warmth to keep your heart emotionally invested, but never enough consistency to let you feel safe. And the terrifying part is that breadcrumbing does not always feel toxic while you're inside it. Sometimes it feels intoxicating. Sometimes it feels meaningful. Sometimes it feels like you found someone emotionally deep who is just scared. So you excuse the distance. You justify the confusion. You tell yourself that mixed signals are somehow proof of complexity instead of proof of instability. But secure people react differently to this entire dynamic, and once you understand how they think, you start realizing how much emotional suffering comes from trying to force clarity out of emotionally unavailable behavior. Because secure people are not hypnotized by emotional inconsistency. They are not addicted to uncertainty. They do not confuse emotional deprivation with love. And if you've ever found yourself overanalyzing replies, replaying conversations in your head, or feeling emotionally addicted to tiny pieces of affection from someone who never fully shows up, then this video is probably going to hit deeper than you expected. And before we go further, if this kind of emotional psychology speaks directly to the parts of yourself you rarely talk about, subscribe, because every video here is designed to put words to the emotional patterns most people silently live through but never fully understand. The first thing secure people notice about avoidant breadcrumbing is not the affection, it's the inconsistency. That's what changes everything. Most emotionally attached people focus on the emotional highs. They remember the deep conversations, the moments of vulnerability, the intensity, the chemistry, the sudden closeness after emotional distance. But secure people pay attention to patterns instead of moments, and that single difference protects them from emotional chaos far earlier. They understand something most people learn too late. Consistency reveals intentions more honestly than emotional intensity ever will, because someone can give you incredible emotional moments and still be emotionally unavailable. Someone can say all the right things and still disappear when real closeness begins to form. Someone can make you feel special while simultaneously refusing to build anything stable with you. Secure people notice this quickly because they are not starving for validation. They are not trying to emotionally win someone over. They are watching whether the connection actually feels emotionally safe over time. And when communication becomes unpredictable, when affection appears only after distance, when closeness feels conditional or temporary, secure people don't immediately internalize it as their fault. They don't instantly panic and think, "What did I do wrong?" Instead, they quietly start recognizing the emotional imbalance for what it is. They understand that healthy connection should not constantly leave you confused about where you stand. They know that real emotional availability does not repeatedly disappear and reappear like a storm you have to survive over and over again. And this is exactly why secure people do not romanticize scarcity the way emotionally anxious people often do. They don't see emotional unavailability as mysterious or emotionally profound. They don't become more attached simply because someone is hard to reach emotionally. In fact, secure people often lose attraction when inconsistency becomes a pattern because emotional instability feels exhausting rather than exciting. But emotionally wounded people sometimes interpret distance differently. They mistake emotional inconsistency for emotional depth. They convince themselves that if someone is difficult to understand, difficult to reach, difficult to keep, then the connection must be more meaningful. And avoidant breadcrumbing feeds directly into that illusion because it creates emotional deprivation followed by temporary relief. One moment you feel disconnected and uncertain, and the next moment they return with affection, attention, vulnerability, or intimacy. That emotional contrast creates attachment because the brain starts chasing the return of emotional closeness. But secure people are not seduced by emotional starvation. They don't see disappearing acts as romance. They don't interpret confusion as chemistry, and they certainly do not believe love should constantly feel emotionally unstable. They understand that emotionally healthy people do not repeatedly create closeness only to retreat the second intimacy becomes real. So instead of becoming more obsessed when someone pulls away, secure people often become more emotionally aware. They stop focusing on potential and start focusing on reality, because they know a person's ability to create emotional moments means nothing if they cannot sustain emotional presence. What shocks avoidant people the most is how calm, secure individuals remain during emotional withdrawal, because breadcrumbing often survives through emotional reactions. It feeds on anxiety, chasing, over-explaining, and emotional pursuit. The avoidant pulls away, and the other person begins fighting to restore connection. That pursuit creates a cycle where emotional distance suddenly becomes powerful. But secure people react differently the first time communication shifts. They notice it, but they do not emotionally collapse around it. They do not immediately abandon themselves trying to regain attention. They don't spiral because someone became inconsistent for a few days. And this calmness can feel deeply unfamiliar to avoidant people who are used to emotional chasing. Secure people still feel disappointment. They still feel confusion sometimes. They are human, but they do not let another person's inconsistency define their self-worth. They don't suddenly feel unlovable because someone became emotionally distant. Instead of obsessively trying to pull the person back closer, they become more observant. They watch. They listen. They allow behavior to reveal the truth naturally. And ironically, this emotional steadiness often unsettles avoidant people more than emotional pursuit ever could, because breadcrumbing loses much of its control when the other person refuses to panic. The dynamic starts breaking apart when someone no longer reacts emotionally to every small withdrawal or temporary return, and secure people understand something powerful. Chasing clarity from emotionally unavailable behavior usually creates even more confusion. So rather than forcing connection, they create space and allow the pattern to expose itself fully. And that leads into another reason secure people protect themselves so effectively in these situations. They value actions more than emotional language. Breadcrumbing often survives through words, through promises, through emotional conversations that sound intimate but never transform into consistent effort. A person disappears for days, then returns with vulnerability. They explain their fears, they express feelings, they say they miss you, they hint at future possibilities, and emotionally attached people often cling to these moments because they feel emotionally significant. But secure people quietly ask themselves something different. Does this person consistently show up? Not occasionally, not emotionally, consistently. Because secure individuals understand that words can create emotional hope while actions reveal emotional capacity. Someone may genuinely feel something for you and still be incapable of building a healthy relationship. Someone may care deeply and still repeatedly create emotional instability. Secure people do not ignore this reality just because the emotional connection feels intense. They know effort matters, presence matters, reliability matters, and they refuse to build entire emotional futures out of temporary moments that never stabilize into trust. That is why breadcrumbing rarely traps secure people for long. The emotional highs may still affect them briefly, but eventually the inconsistency outweighs the chemistry. Reality becomes louder than potential. And once secure people recognize that someone only offers fragments of connection instead of full emotional presence, they stop trying to force intimacy from someone who continuously withholds it. And the reason secure people can reach that point emotionally is because breadcrumbing loses much of its influence when self-doubt is no longer controlling the relationship. That is the hidden engine underneath almost every avoidant dynamic. The quiet fear that if someone becomes distant, it must mean you were not enough. Most people trapped inside breadcrumbing are not only attached to the person, they are attached to the possibility of finally feeling chosen. So every delayed reply feels personal. Every withdrawal feels like rejection. Every return feels like relief. The emotional roller coaster becomes tied directly to self-worth. But secure people are not constantly measuring their value through another person's emotional availability. They do not automatically assume distance means they are failing, and because of that, breadcrumbing has far less emotional leverage over them. They can feel disappointment without collapsing into self-abandonment. They can acknowledge attraction without sacrificing clarity. They can care deeply about someone while still recognizing unhealthy patterns. That emotional grounding changes everything because breadcrumbing survives through emotional confusion. It survives through unanswered questions, through overthinking, through wondering if maybe this time things will finally stabilize. But secure people do not stay trapped in emotional ambiguity for long because they trust themselves enough to face uncomfortable truths directly. They are willing to admit when someone's behavior consistently creates instability instead of endlessly rewriting reality to protect the fantasy of connection. And that level of emotional honesty can feel almost shocking to people who are used to surviving on hope instead of consistency. That is why secure people tend to ask direct questions much earlier than most others would. They are not interested in decoding hidden meanings forever. They are not trying to spiritually interpret delayed messages, mixed signals, or emotionally confusing behavior. They believe healthy relationships should be able to survive honest conversations. So when inconsistency becomes noticeable, secure people calmly seek clarity instead of silently suffering. They ask where things are going. They ask what the other person actually wants. They ask why emotional closeness keeps disappearing every time vulnerability starts growing. And this is where avoidant breadcrumbing often becomes exposed, because emotionally unavailable people frequently thrive in vague emotional territory. Ambiguity allows them to maintain connection without fully committing to emotional responsibility. But secure individuals unintentionally remove that safety net because they bring the relationship into the open where actions and intentions have to align. And what makes this so powerful is the energy behind the questions. Secure people are not interrogating from panic. They are not begging for reassurance. They are simply refusing to emotionally invest in confusion forever. If the answers remain unclear, inconsistent, or emotionally evasive, secure people do not usually keep forcing deeper attachment. They start emotionally stepping back because clarity matters more to them than emotional fantasy. They understand that someone unwilling to define the connection is often benefiting from keeping it undefined. And once you emotionally understand that, breadcrumbing becomes far less seductive because you stop interpreting vagueness as emotional depth and start recognizing it as emotional instability. Secure people also refuse to compete for emotional access, and this is one of the biggest reasons avoidant dynamics struggle to control them long term. Emotionally anxious individuals often feel they must earn consistency. They unconsciously begin performing for affection, becoming more understanding, more patient, more emotionally available, more accommodating, hoping that if they love hard enough, prove themselves enough, or wait long enough, the avoidant person will finally open fully. But secure people do not approach love like a competition for emotional scraps. They do not believe connection should constantly feel conditional. They are willing to put in effort, but they expect mutual effort in return. And when they realize they are carrying the emotional weight of the relationship alone, something shifts internally. Instead of trying harder, they begin pulling their energy back, not to manipulate, not to punish, but because emotionally healthy people naturally recognize imbalance over time. They understand that love cannot survive indefinitely on one person's emotional labor. So while breadcrumbing often creates a dynamic where one person chases and the other controls emotional distance, secure individuals quietly step outside the cycle altogether. They stop trying to convince someone to choose them consistently. They stop treating emotional inconsistency like a puzzle that needs solving, and this can deeply confuse avoidant individuals because many are accustomed to relationships where distance increases pursuit, but secure people do not become more attached through emotional deprivation. If anything, repeated inconsistency slowly disconnects them emotionally because their nervous system begins recognizing the relationship as emotionally unsafe rather than emotionally exciting. And one of the most misunderstood things secure people recognize is the difference between healthy independence and emotional avoidance. This is where many people get trapped for months or even years because avoidant breadcrumbing is often disguised as needing space, being busy, or struggling with vulnerability. And to be fair, sometimes those things are true. Secure people understand that everyone needs personal space. They understand that independence matters. They are not demanding constant attention or emotional intensity every second. But they also know that emotional unavailability becomes visible through patterns, not excuses. A healthy person may need time alone, but they still communicate. They still create emotional safety. They still show consistent care even during stressful periods. Avoidant breadcrumbing feels different because closeness repeatedly disappears the moment emotional intimacy starts deepening. Communication becomes inconsistent exactly when vulnerability increases. Affection appears and disappears unpredictably. Emotional availability feels conditional instead of stable. And secure people eventually stop ignoring these patterns simply because the explanations sound emotionally reasonable. They judge the relationship by how it consistently feels, not by how convincing the explanations are. Because someone can have understandable wounds and still create unhealthy dynamics. Someone can struggle emotionally and still be incapable of giving stable love. Secure people have compassion for this, but they do not sacrifice themselves trying to rescue emotionally unavailable people from their own patterns. They understand that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And maybe the biggest emotional difference of all is that secure people refuse to build entire relationships out of imagined potential. They do not fall in love only with who someone could become someday. They stay connected to what actually exists in the present. And this is incredibly difficult for emotionally attached people because breadcrumbing constantly feeds possibility. Tiny moments of closeness create visions of the future. One vulnerable conversation suddenly makes you believe the walls are finally coming down. One emotionally intimate night makes you think the relationship is transforming. And because the connection feels emotionally powerful in certain moments, people begin emotionally filling in the gaps themselves. They create a future emotionally that the relationship has never consistently shown in reality. But secure people continuously return to the present. They ask themselves difficult questions. Is this connection actually becoming healthier over time? Is emotional safety increasing? Is consistency growing, or am I emotionally surviving on occasional moments while ignoring the overall instability? And those questions protect them from getting trapped inside fantasy bonds that never fully materialize into healthy relationships. Because secure people understand that chemistry can exist without compatibility. Attraction can exist without stability. Emotional intensity can exist without emotional safety. And once someone fully understands that, breadcrumbing starts losing its emotional magic entirely. And this is exactly why breadcrumbing begins to completely malfunction when secure people stop emotionally chasing the connection. Because the entire dynamic quietly depends on emotional pursuit. It depends on someone anxiously waiting, wondering, hoping, checking their phone, replaying conversations, and emotionally holding space for inconsistency. The avoidant person pulls away, and the other person rushes emotionally forward to close the gap. That cycle creates a strange sense of control where distance becomes powerful. But secure people eventually interrupt the pattern simply by refusing to participate in it. When communication disappears, they do not instantly overextend themselves trying to restore intimacy. When affection suddenly returns after silence, they do not automatically reward the inconsistency with deeper emotional investment. They stay emotionally aware, present, calm. And what becomes fascinating is how often avoidant individuals suddenly become more emotionally attentive once the chasing energy disappears. Because for perhaps the first time, they are no longer interacting with someone whose self-worth depends on maintaining the connection at all costs. The emotional atmosphere changes entirely. The secure person is still kind, still emotionally open, still capable of connection, but they are no longer emotionally available for instability. And that shift can feel deeply unsettling for avoidant people because many are unconsciously accustomed to relationships where emotional distance increases their value. Suddenly, they are standing in front of someone who is not trying to win them over, rescue them, decode them, or emotionally survive on fragments of attention. And without realizing it, secure people force the relationship into reality. The avoidant can no longer rely on intermittent affection alone to sustain emotional access. Consistency becomes necessary. Accountability becomes visible. Emotional absence finally has consequences. And this is often the moment where the avoidant person either begins confronting their own relational patterns or retreats even further into emotional distance. What makes secure people so emotionally difficult to manipulate is that they remain deeply connected to themselves while inside relationships. Breadcrumbing often works by slowly making the relationship emotionally central to someone's entire internal world. Their mood starts depending on the next message. Their confidence rises and falls with attention. Their peace disappears inside uncertainty. But secure people do not abandon their own lives simply because attraction exists. They continue investing in their routines, friendships, goals, emotional health, and sense of identity even while developing feelings for someone. And this matters more than people realize because emotional dependency creates vulnerability to inconsistency. When one person becomes your only emotional source of validation, even small withdrawals begin feeling devastating. But secure individuals spread emotional meaning across their lives in healthy ways. Love becomes an addition to their emotional world, not the sole foundation holding it together. So when avoidant breadcrumbing appears, secure people feel the discomfort without losing themselves inside it. They do not stop living because someone became distant emotionally. They do not spend every waking hour trying to recover emotional certainty. And ironically, this groundedness often makes them appear even more attractive because they carry emotional stability instead of emotional desperation. But more importantly, it protects them. Because emotionally secure people understand that relationships should complement your life, not consume your identity. And the moment a connection starts requiring self-abandonment to maintain emotional closeness, they begin recognizing that something unhealthy is unfolding beneath the chemistry. That recognition eventually leads secure people to a place many emotionally attached individuals fear deeply: the willingness to walk away from ambiguity. Not because they lack feelings, not because they never cared, but because peace becomes more important than emotional confusion. This is one of the hardest truths for people trapped in breadcrumbing to accept: that secure people are not stronger because they feel less. They are stronger because they stop negotiating against reality. They stop bargaining with inconsistency. They stop trying to emotionally survive inside situations that repeatedly destabilize them. And there comes a moment where they quietly realize something painful but freeing. If someone truly wants connection, you should not constantly have to convince them to participate in it. You should not repeatedly feel emotionally abandoned every time intimacy increases. You should not need endless patience just to receive basic consistency. Secure people understand that uncertainty itself becomes an answer after enough time passes. Not every emotionally unavailable person is malicious. Some are deeply wounded. Some are terrified of vulnerability. Some genuinely care but lack the emotional capacity to sustain intimacy consistently. But secure people stop confusing compassion with obligation. They realize they can empathize with someone's pain without sacrificing their own emotional well-being to carry it. And when they finally detach from the cycle, it often happens quietly. No dramatic revenge, no endless arguments. Just a slow emotional acceptance that the connection is no longer healthy enough to keep investing in. And that quiet detachment can feel devastating to avoidant individuals because secure people rarely leave through explosive emotional chaos. They leave through clarity. And strangely enough, this is often when avoidant individuals become more emotionally interested than ever before. Because once the secure person emotionally releases the need for validation, the dynamic changes in a way the avoidant can suddenly feel. The pressure disappears. The chasing disappears, the emotional overfunctioning disappears, and for many avoidant people, distance only feels safe until they sense the other person truly detaching emotionally. That is when panic sometimes begins surfacing beneath the avoidance. Suddenly, the secure person feels harder to access emotionally, not because they are playing games, but because they genuinely stopped trying to force connection into existence. And that emotional shift can activate something powerful inside avoidant individuals: the fear of losing someone who finally stopped revolving around them emotionally. They begin reaching out more, showing curiosity, creating closeness again, sometimes even offering the